She woke up before the sun had even risen, her eyes heavy but her heart already racing with the worries of another long day. The small apartment was quiet, except for the gentle breathing of her little child still asleep on a worn-out mattress in the corner. She tiptoed around, trying not to wake the child, and looked at the clock. It was almost 5 in the morning. There was barely enough time to prepare breakfast before she had to leave for work. Her life had become a cycle of endless tasks: working, cooking, cleaning, and making sure her child had what was needed. Every coin she earned was stretched thin, and still it never seemed enough. Bills piled up on the table, and she often skipped meals so that her child wouldn't go hungry. Some nights she cried quietly in the bathroom so no one would see her tears. But every morning, she forced herself to smile for the little one who depended on her completely. Outside their apartment building, the city was waking up slowly. Vendors set up their stalls, buses rumbled down the streets, and people hurried off to their jobs. Among them lived an elderly man, a quiet figure who spent most of his days sitting on a bench near the park. He was not someone people paid much attention to. His clothes were simple, his steps a little slower than they used to be, and his hair had turned gray long ago. Yet, his eyes noticed things most others overlooked. He often saw the young mother rushing down the street with her child's hand in hers, carrying too many bags, looking worn out but determined. He had watched her many mornings, and in her tired smile he could sense an unspoken story. She reminded him of years long past, when life was hard, but he had someone to protect. Something about her touched his heart, though he never said a word. That morning, as she hurried off again, the child tugged at her sleeve and asked for a sweet from a nearby shop. She gently knelt down, explaining softly that maybe next week they could buy one. Her voice carried warmth, but her eyes told a different story, one of worry, of guilt, of wanting to give more, but not being able to. The elderly man, sitting just a few feet away, lowered his gaze, feeling her quiet pain as if it were his own. Her days were filled with work at a small cafe, where she washed dishes and wiped tables for hours on end. The job was tiring, the pay was little, but it was all she could find. Each time a customer smiled at her or thanked her, it gave her a tiny bit of strength to keep going. But deep down, she knew she was running on empty. At night, when she returned home, her body ached, her mind was heavy, and yet she stayed awake just to sew small repairs on her child's clothes or fix a toy that had broken. She refused to let the child feel the full weight of their struggles. The elderly man noticed her again that evening. She walked slowly this time, carrying her child who had fallen asleep on her shoulder. Her steps were heavy, but she didn't complain. She simply shifted the child's weight, tightened her grip on the bag of groceries, and kept moving. The man's heart softened at the sight. He thought of his own younger days, when he too had carried his children home after long nights. Time had taken much from him, family, friends, the energy he once had. But watching her fight so quietly against life's hardships made him see his own reflection in her struggle. Though they had never spoken, an invisible thread connected them. She didn't know that someone was silently watching over her, someone who admired her courage. And he didn't know that one day, fate would bring them together in a way that neither of them could have imagined. As she tucked her child into bed that night, she whispered promises of better days to come. She didn't know how or when, but she believed life had to change someday. She believed kindness still existed in the world, though she had seen so little of it lately. And somewhere not far away, the elderly stranger, sitting alone in his room, thought of her too. He wondered how long she could keep carrying so much on her shoulders. Life had a way of weaving stories without warning. Two people, one weary from years of hardship and another worn down by time, were walking separate paths in the same city. Neither knew yet that their paths were about to cross, and that moment would not just change their days, it would change their lives forever. The evening was cool, and the streetlights flickered on as the young mother hurried home with her child. The day had been long, Her back ached from standing for hours at the cafe, and her feet felt heavy as stones. Still, she walked quickly, wanting to get her child safely inside before the night grew too late. The little one clung to her hand, yawning softly, and she squeezed those tiny fingers as if promising silently that everything would be all right. But as they turned the corner near their building, her heart sank. Standing by the entrance was the one person she had hoped not to see that night. His eyes were sharp, his voice already raised before she could even greet him. The child shrank behind her, sensing the tension immediately. She tried to calm the situation, her voice soft and steady, asking him not to make a scene. But the words only fueled his anger. His tone grew louder, his hands waving wildly as he accused her of things she hadn't done, blaming her for problems that weren't hers to carry. Her chest tightened. She tried to shield the child with her body, telling the little one to stay quiet, to stay close. She had faced moments like this before, moments when the world seemed to stop, when she wished someone, anyone, would step in. But most people turned away. They walked faster, pretending not to notice. And tonight, too, people passed by, their eyes flickering toward the noise only for a second before hurrying on. The elderly man sat on his usual bench near the corner, watching the scene unfold. He had seen arguments before, but something about this one gripped him differently. The young mother's shoulders trembled, not from anger, but from fear. The child's small hands clutched at her clothes, desperate for safety. The old man's jaw tightened. His heart pounded harder than it had in years. He told himself to stay out of it. After all, he was just an old man. What could he do? But then he thought of all the times in his life when he had wished someone would have stood beside him, or beside his loved ones, in their darkest hours. His hands shook slightly as he pushed himself up from the bench. His steps were slow but steady as he approached. The man's raised voice startled her again, and the child began to cry quietly. She held the little one closer, whispering that everything was fine, though it was not. And then, suddenly, a voice interrupted. It was calm, deep, and carried the weight of age. "That's enough," the elderly stranger said. Stepping between them, the young mother froze. She had never seen this man before up close, only noticed him in passing. The abuser frowned, anger flashing at the interruption. "This has nothing to do with you, old man," he snapped. But the stranger didn't move away. He stood tall, his thin frame straightened by the strength of conviction. "It has everything to do with me," the old man replied quietly. "When I see a child afraid, when I see a mother being treated like this, it concerns me." The street felt different suddenly. People walking by slowed, their eyes now drawn to the unusual sight of an elderly man standing firm. For the first time, the abuser seemed unsure. He glanced around, realizing he was no longer unseen. His voice lost some of its sharpness, though his anger still boiled beneath the surface. The young mother's breath caught in her chest. She didn't know this man, yet his presence felt like a shield. Her child, sensing the change, clung tighter but peeked out from behind her, curious about the stranger who had spoken with such quiet power. "Go home," the old man said firmly. "Leave her and the child alone." There was a long silence. The man's fists clenched, but the old stranger's unwavering eyes held him still. The weight of years, of wisdom, of a life lived with lessons hard-earned, seemed to pour out from those eyes. Finally, with a frustrated mutter, the man turned away and stormed off down the street. The young mother stood frozen for a moment, unable to believe what had just happened. Her body shook with the release of tension she had held in for so long. She looked at the elderly man, her lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. Her child, still pressed against her, whispered softly, "Mama, he helped us." Tears welled in her eyes. She bent down to hold her child close, then looked up again at the stranger. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling with both fear and relief. The old man nodded slowly, his face kind but serious. You don't have to thank me. No one should have to face something like that alone." For a long moment, they simply stood there under the streetlight, 3 lives connected by a single act of courage. She didn't know it yet, but this night would be the beginning of something far greater than she could imagine. The old man, who had lived so many years in quiet solitude, had found a reason to step forward again. And the young mother, who had carried her burdens alone for so long, had finally felt the presence of someone who truly cared. What began as a frightening night was slowly transforming into the start of a bond that would change both their lives forever. The street was quieter now, though her heart was still racing. The young mother stood under the pale glow of the streetlight, her child clinging tightly to her side. She tried to steady her breathing, but her chest rose and fell too quickly, as if the fear from moments ago refused to leave her body. The man who had caused the scene was gone, yet the weight of his presence lingered. For years she had learned to live with this kind of fear, pushing it down, convincing herself to endure. But tonight had been different tonight. Someone had stepped in. The elderly stranger stood only a few feet away, his hands folded in front of him. He didn't crowd her, didn't ask for anything, only watched with soft, thoughtful eyes. His face carried the lines of time, each wrinkle carved by years of living. But in his expression, there was nothing but quiet concern. "You're safe now," he said gently, his voice low, steady, like a calm wave easing onto the shore. She swallowed hard, clutching her child closer. The little one peeked up at the man curiously, no longer crying but still holding tightly to her. The stranger lowered himself slightly, bending his knees despite the stiffness it brought him, so he could meet the child's eyes without towering over them. A faint smile tugged at his lips. "You were very brave," he told the little one softly. "Holding onto your mama like that. You gave her strength." The child blinked, surprised, then buried their face shyly into the mother's side. For the first time that evening, a small, fragile warmth flickered inside her heart. The stranger had spoken with such gentleness, as though he understood that fear had left a mark, but also that courage was hidden within them both. "I don't know what to say," she whispered, finally finding her voice. Her throat felt tight, and her words cracked as they came out. "You don't have to say anything," the old man replied. "Sometimes, just knowing you're not alone is enough." Something in his words made her eyes sting. For so long she had carried the weight of life by herself, too ashamed or afraid to ask for help. Every day was a battle, and she had convinced herself that no one cared, that no one ever would. Yet here was this man, a stranger who owed her nothing, choosing to stand up when others had walked away. He glanced at the bag she had dropped in the commotion. Groceries spilled across the pavement, apples rolling near the curb, a loaf of bread resting on the cold ground, a carton of milk tipped to its side. Without a word, he bent down slowly, his knees protesting, and began gathering the items. She moved to stop him, embarrassed, but he shook his head lightly. "Let me help," he said simply. She watched him pick up the bag, his hands steady despite his age. There was no judgment in his movements, only quiet care. When he handed the bag back, she noticed how gently he placed it in her arms, as though even something so ordinary deserved respect. "Thank you," she murmured again, her voice softer this time. The old man gave her a nod, his eyes kind. "Take your little one home. Rest tonight. Tomorrow will come, and you'll be stronger than you know." His words lingered with her as she turned toward her building. She had heard people tell her to be strong before, but it had always sounded like a demand, like something heavy. Tonight, when he said it, it felt different. It felt like hope that the child tugged at her sleeve as they walked. "Mama, he was nice," the little one whispered. She glanced back once, and there he was still standing near the streetlight, watching only long enough to make sure they reached the door safely. He gave a small wave when their eyes met, and then turned back toward his bench. That night, after she put her child to bed, she sat by the window for a long while, staring out at the street below. The world outside was the same: cars passing, neighbors hurrying home, but inside her chest something had shifted. The memory of the stranger's calm voice and steady presence replayed in her mind. For the first time in months, maybe years, she didn't feel completely invisible. On the other side of the street, the old man walked slowly back to his small apartment. His body was tired, but his heart was unexpectedly full. He had acted on impulse, driven by something he could not ignore. All evening, he thought about the young mother and her child. He thought of the strength it must take for her to survive each day, and of the loneliness that must shadow her. He, too, knew what loneliness felt like. His home was quiet, too quiet most nights, and sometimes the silence pressed down on him like a weight. But tonight, that silence felt a little lighter. Neither of them knew what the coming days would bring. But both carried something new within them, now a spark of kindness, a reminder that even in a world that often turned away, a single act could mean everything. The young mother fell asleep that night, with her child's small hand resting in hers, her heart a little steadier. And the elderly stranger, as he closed his eyes, thought to himself that maybe life still had a way of giving meaning. Even in the later years, the morning after that frightening night felt strangely different. The young mother woke up, expecting the same heaviness that usually clung to her chest. But as sunlight streamed through the thin curtains, she remembered the man who had stood between her and fear. She remembered his calm voice, his steady eyes, his quiet strength. For the first time in a long while, the thought of yesterday didn't leave her feeling broken. It left her with a faint sense of comfort. She dressed her child and prepared for another long day. As they stepped outside, she couldn't help but glance toward the park bench where she often saw the old man sitting. And there he was, as if the world had placed him there just for her to see. He sat quietly, his hands resting on a cane, his eyes watching the people who hurried past without noticing him. When he caught sight of her, he offered a small, gentle nod. It was not the kind of nod people gave in passing. It was warmer, as if to say, "I see you." Her child tugged at her hand and whispered, "Mama, that's the man who helped us." She smiled faintly, feeling a little lighter, and gave the old man a wave before continuing down the street. Later that afternoon, when she returned from the cafe, she saw him again. This time, instead of just passing by, she slowed her steps. She hesitated for a moment, her heart unsure if she should disturb him. But something inside urged her forward. "Good evening," she said softly. The man looked up, and his face broke into the kind of smile that made him seem younger for a moment. "Good evening," he replied. His voice carried the same calmness as before, as though nothing in the world could rush him. She shifted the grocery bag in her hand, not knowing what else to say. But before the silence grew too heavy, he nodded at her child. "How was your day, little one?" The child brightened immediately, their shyness fading. "I helped Mama today," they said proudly. The old man chuckled softly, his eyes twinkling. "That makes you the best helper she could ever ask for." It was a small exchange, but it warmed her heart more than she expected. For so long, kindness had been scarce in her life. Even a few simple words felt like sunlight after a long winter. She found herself pausing longer each time they crossed paths. A greeting turned into a few sentences, and a few sentences turned into small conversations. He began to share stories from his past, not in grand detail, but little pieces here and there. He spoke of the days when his children were young, of the evenings when life felt heavy, but he kept moving forward for their sake. His voice held both sorrow and strength, as though he carried memories that still lived deep inside him. She listened quietly, sometimes nodding, sometimes smiling. Realizing that he had walked through struggles too. In return, she shared bits of her own life. She didn't tell him everything at once. Trust was slow, like a door opening inch by inch. But she told him about the cafe, about how hard she worked, about the hope she carried for her child's future. He listened without judgment, never interrupting. never making her feel weak for admitting how tired she often felt. The child grew fond of him quickly. Each time they passed the bench, the little one would rush forward with a grin, eager to tell him about their day. Sometimes it was about a drawing they made, sometimes about a new word they learned, sometimes about something as simple as seeing a bird in the park. The old man always listened as if it were the most important story in the world. One evening, when he noticed the tired look in her eyes, he offered a quiet piece of advice. "You're doing more than you realize," he said gently. "Every smile on that child's face, every step forward you take, it all matters. Don't doubt the strength you carry." The words struck her deeply. She had grown used to criticism, to being told she wasn't enough. To hear the opposite, spoken with sincerity, felt like a balm she hadn't known she needed. That night, she lay awake for a while, thinking of his words. For the first time, she let herself believe that maybe she was stronger than she thought. Days turned into weeks, and the bond between them deepened. It was not forced, not rushed, it grew naturally, like a tree finding its roots. He became a steady presence in her life, someone she could look toward when the days felt heavy. And for him, she and her child brought a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. The loneliness that had once shadowed his evenings began to fade, replaced by the warmth of connection. Sometimes he would walk a short distance with them, making sure they reached home safely. Other times, he would simply sit with them for a few minutes, sharing quiet company. It wasn't about grand gestures, it was about the small, consistent moments of kindness that stitched their lives together. Neither of them said it out loud, but they both knew something important was happening. A friendship was forming, one built on trust, respect, and the simple but powerful truth that no one should carry their burdens alone. And slowly, without even realizing it, their lives were beginning to change in ways they had never expected. The weeks turned into months, and what had begun as a single act of courage slowly grew into something neither of them had expected. The young mother and her child no longer walked through their days feeling completely alone. There was now a familiar presence, a kind figure who appeared like a steady light in their routine. The elderly stranger, who once sat quietly on a park bench unnoticed by most, had become a part of their little world. For the mother, his kindness became a source of strength. She began to hold her head a little higher, to carry herself with a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. When her long shifts at the cafe left her exhausted, she found herself remembering his words, "You're doing more than you realize." It made her push forward with a renewed sense of purpose. The hopelessness that used to weigh her down began to fade, replaced by the belief that life could, in fact, be better. Her child, too, flourished in the warmth of their growing friendship. The laughter of the little one became brighter, freer. The old man was patient and gentle, listening with genuine interest to every story about school, every silly observation, every small dream whispered aloud. To the child, he became like a grandfather, someone to look up to, someone to feel safe with. But what surprised her most was how deeply he had changed as well. She noticed it one evening when she saw him walking with a lighter step than before, his eyes brighter, his voice carrying a soft energy. Once, his life had been filled with long, quiet evenings that echoed with loneliness. He had thought his best years were long behind him. Yet now he had a reason to get up each morning, a reason to go outside, a reason to smile. He told her one day, in a voice tinged with emotion, "I didn't know I still had something to give. But meeting you and your little one, it's given me more than I can put into words." She felt tears gather in her eyes at his honesty. "You've given us hope," she whispered. "And that means everything." It wasn't about money or grand gifts, it was about presence, about the way he made them feel seen and valued. In a world where she had grown used to being overlooked, he reminded her that she mattered. And in a life where he had begun to feel invisible, she and her child reminded him that he still had purpose. Their bond deepened with each passing day. He became a trusted figure she could lean on, and she became the family he never thought he would have again. They started sharing small traditions like walking together on Sundays through the park, or sitting on the bench as the child played nearby. Sometimes they shared simple meals, laughing softly as the child filled the room with chatter. Other times they simply sat in silence, the comfort of companionship needing no words. Neighbors began to notice too. They saw how the young mother looked stronger, how the child's laughter echoed more often, how the old man no longer seemed so alone on his bench. Whispers of admiration spread quietly. People wondered how such a simple connection could change 3 lives so profoundly. One afternoon, as the child ran ahead chasing butterflies, the mother sat beside the elderly man and let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Do you ever think about how one small moment can change everything?" she asked. He nodded slowly, his eyes following the child's joy. "All the time. Life isn't just made of big moments. It's the small ones, the times when you decide to step forward, when you choose to care, that shape everything." She thought back to that night under the streetlight, when he had taken a single step forward to protect her and her child. It had seemed small at the time, but it had changed everything. It had turned strangers into family. Months later, when the seasons shifted and the air grew cooler, the young mother realized just how far they had come. She no longer felt the same crushing loneliness when she looked at her life. She had someone to talk to, someone to trust, someone who cared not because they had to, but because they wanted to. The child, too, thrived under the warmth of this new bond, their world brighter and safer than before. And for the elderly stranger, every day now carried meaning. The quiet solitude that once filled his evenings was replaced by laughter, by stories, by the joy of watching a child grow. His heart, once heavy with the weight of years, now felt light with the beauty of connection. What had begun with a single act of bravery had blossomed into a bond that would last a lifetime. Their lives were no longer defined by fear, loneliness, or hardship, but by the love and respect they had found in each other. And so, under the same streetlight where their paths had first crossed, they often found themselves pausing together, the child holding both their hands, 3 souls bound by fate. What started as a stranger stepping in had become a story of family, of healing, and of lives forever changed.